On a cold April night in 1912, the largest ship in the world slid quietly beneath the waves of the North Atlantic. Everyone knows the name, Titanic. We know the broad strokes, the iceberg, the lifeboats, the orchestra that played as the deck tilted into darkness. But beneath those familiar headlines lie details, forgotten secrets that rarely make it into the movies or the history books. The small choices, the overlooked moments, the quiet stories of survival and loss that give the Titanic its haunting power more than a century later. Tonight, we'll travel slowly through those memories. We'll talk not only about the tragedy, but about the curious details of daily life aboard the ship, the routines of its passengers, the hidden corners of its decks, and the small decisions that sealed its fate. These are the stories that slip through the cracks of history, waiting patiently, like the ship itself, beneath the surface. Welcome to Boring History for Sleep, where we wander calmly through the past in long, quiet detail. If you'd like to join these journeys again, take a moment now to gently tap the like button and subscribe. That way, the next time you want to drift off with history's forgotten stories, they'll be waiting for you. Now, settle in, breathe slowly, and let's return to the Titanic. Not the myth, not the movie, but the forgotten secrets that still rest in the silence of the sea.
Long before the Titanic ever struck an iceberg, it carried another weight, an invisible one. It was the burden of a single word: unsinkable. The story goes that newspapers and shipbuilders repeated the phrase until it became fact in the public mind. And here lies the first forgotten secret of the Titanic. The ship was never truly advertised as unsinkable in official terms. The White Star Line, the company that owned her, was more cautious. They called her practically unsinkable, a phrase meant to suggest safety without tempting fate. But in a world hungry for marvels, the nuance disappeared. By the time Titanic set sail from Southampton in April 1912, she was no longer practically anything. She was, in popular imagination, invincible. This was not simply optimism, it was a reflection of the age. The early 20th century was an era intoxicated with technology. The Eiffel Tower pierced the sky, airplanes were beginning to fly, and electricity was transforming homes. To many, Titanic was the crown jewel of this confidence, the largest moving object ever built by human hands, a floating city of steel. It stretched nearly 3 football fields in length, taller than many skyscrapers of its day, with engines that could carry more than 2,000 people across the Atlantic in luxury. To believe it could sink was to doubt the progress of civilization itself. Yet beneath this glittering promise, there were cracks, subtle but deadly. The very design that made Titanic seem invincible also made it vulnerable. Its system of watertight compartments, hailed as revolutionary, was imperfect. The bulkheads rose only a few decks high. Water could spill over them like a staircase. Its lifeboats, enough for only half the passengers, were dismissed as unnecessary because, after all, the ship was unsinkable. This is the cruel irony. The myth of safety reduced safety itself. Passengers felt this confidence. On board, letters written during the voyage spoke of the Titanic's size, its smoothness, its sense of permanence. Some described it as a hotel more than a ship. Few expressed fear. Even when the iceberg was struck, many hesitated to leave their cabins. Lifeboats hung in the davits half empty because people believed staying on board was safer than stepping into the cold Atlantic. The myth had worked too well. It lulled people into calm when urgency was needed. And yet, here is the secret detail often overlooked. Not everyone was fooled. Among the crew, some whispered concerns. Engineers knew the limitations of the bulkheads. Officers knew that even the best ship could be brought down by ice. But hierarchy, discipline, and the desire not to alarm passengers kept those doubts quiet. The Titanic sailed forward, burdened by silence as much by steel. So when we think of the word unsinkable, we should see it not as a boast, but as a trap. It was less a fact about the ship than a story about human faith in progress. The Titanic was not only undone by an iceberg, it was undone by belief. And that is perhaps the first forgotten secret, that the tragedy began not in the Atlantic, but in the mind, long before the ship left port.
When people think of the Titanic, they picture the iceberg, the lifeboats, the orchestra. They picture the night of tragedy. But to truly understand the ship, we must step back and imagine her as she was during those first days at sea, not a wreck, but alive. For in April 1912, before the collision, the Titanic was not a disaster. It was a city, and within her steel walls, life unfolded with a rhythm as complex and fascinating as any town on land. The first forgotten secret of Titanic is this: it was not just a ship. It was a miniature world, carrying people from every walk of life. There were millionaires in silk suits, poor immigrants with only a suitcase, sailors who had worked ships their whole lives, cooks, cleaners, stewards, stokers, over 2,000 people, all living together, each with their own hopes, routines, and worries. For 4 days, they created a society at sea, one that reflected the world they had left behind, but also became something unique. Let us walk through this floating city. Start at the very top, where the wealthiest passengers enjoyed the first-class accommodations. Their cabins were not cabins at all, but suites, some with private promenades, ornate fireplaces, and furnishings equal to the grandest hotels in London or New York. Imagine waking in a feather bed as the morning sun glimmered across the North Atlantic. A steward brought breakfast on a silver tray: eggs, toast, fruit, coffee. You stepped out onto the deck, strolling beneath polished railings, the sea stretching blue and calm in every direction. To these passengers, Titanic was not merely transport. It was luxury, a floating palace where each day was a display of refinement. Below them, in second class, life was humbler but still respectable. School teachers, clergymen, clerks, and families filled these cabins, simple but clean and well lit. They dined together in their own saloon, where meals were plain but hearty: roast meats, potatoes, puddings. For many, it was the best accommodation they had ever experienced at sea, a chance to travel across the Atlantic with dignity. Letters written home spoke of surprise at how comfortable the voyage was, how kind the stewards, and how grand the ship seemed even from their deck. And then, deep in the ship, was third class: the emigrants, the dreamers, the families bound for new lives in America. Here the cabins were crowded, often 4 to a room with bunks and shared washrooms. The meals were simple: bread, soup, stew, tea. But even this was far better than steerage on most ships of the era. Titanic's third class had dining rooms, a rarity, and even a piano in the common room. For many, it was a revelation, a taste of comfort as they journeyed to an uncertain future. Children ran through the corridors, men gathered to play cards, women talked quietly about their hopes for jobs or farms across the ocean. In their letters, passengers described Titanic as like a hotel, compared to the misery of other ships. What made this world so captivating was not just the hierarchy of class, but the way they all lived together. First-class promenades gleamed with brass and mahogany, while deep below, stokers shoveled coal into furnaces that glowed red, driving the engines that made luxury possible. Above, passengers danced in elegant rooms. Below, men sweated in heat that reached over 100 degrees Fahrenheit, their faces blackened with soot. The Titanic was a machine of contrasts: glory above, labor below. Every fine dinner, every shining chandelier was powered by hands no passenger would ever see. There were also routines, the steady heartbeat of a city at sea. Each morning, stewards knocked on doors with gentle calls of "Good morning, tea or coffee." Bells rang for meal times. Children gathered on deck to play with hoops and balls, their laughter carried by the wind. Ladies strolled in hats and furs, wrapped in rugs against the chill. Men smoked cigars in lounges decorated with carved wood and paintings. The hum of conversation filled the air, mingling with the deep vibration of the engines. Life on Titanic had rhythm, comfort, even boredom. For most aboard, it was simply a voyage, and the future stretched wide and safe. But behind this normality lay small details, forgotten secrets that make the story sharper. Did you know that Titanic carried a fully functioning Turkish bath, complete with steam rooms, electric baths, and masseurs? That it had a squash court where passengers played games while outside the ocean stretched empty? There was even a swimming pool, the first of its kind on a transatlantic liner, filled with cold seawater. These luxuries seemed excessive at the time, and yet they reflected the ship's ambition to be not just safe, not just efficient, but unforgettable. There were also oddities of design. Lifeboats, fewer than needed, were covered with tarpaulins and stacked neatly, giving the impression they were almost decorative. Some passengers even complained that they spoiled the view from the promenade. The great grand staircase, polished and ornate, became the ship's symbol, a place where passengers lingered, not realizing it would one day be immortalized as a backdrop for tragedy. And then there was the orchestra. 8 musicians, hired to entertain passengers, played tirelessly in lounges and dining rooms. Their music filled the ship with familiarity, reminding people of home. These men were not officers, not sailors, not scientists. They were entertainers, yet their role would become legendary. In the days before the sinking, they played waltzes and popular tunes as couples danced and sipped drinks. In those moments, Titanic was less a ship and more a world, a stage upon which human life unfolded in all its variety. What is striking looking back is how ordinary it all seemed. Passengers wrote postcards describing the calm sea, the good food, the friendly company. Children remembered the games they played. Few letters spoke of fear. To live on Titanic was to live in a dream of modernity, smooth, steady, secure. The idea that anything could go wrong seemed impossible. And that is the second forgotten secret. That for 4 days, Titanic was not tragedy, but triumph. For 4 days, it was a city alive, a society afloat, a perfect illusion of safety. When the iceberg came, it shattered not only steel, but routine. The lifeboat drills that had been postponed suddenly mattered. The musicians who had played for entertainment played instead for courage. The class divisions that had seemed natural suddenly became a matter of life and death. But before all of that, Titanic was simply alive. And to understand her story, we must remember those ordinary days, the strolls on deck, the meals in dining halls, the laughter of children, the music drifting through lounges. Because tragedy is never only about the final moment. It is about the life that was lived before, the small details that make the loss so heavy. The Titanic was more than a ship. It was a living city. And for those who walked her decks in April 1912, it must have felt eternal. That is why her sinking still haunts us, not because a ship went down, but because a whole world went with it.
When we think of the Titanic, a few names rise above the rest. Captain Edward Smith, the millionaire John Jacob Astor, perhaps the unsinkable Molly Brown. But the Titanic carried more than 2,000 souls, and most of their stories never made it into the spotlight. They were ordinary people, farmers, teachers, cooks, musicians, maids. Yet within their lives were details as haunting, as human, as unforgettable as the iceberg itself. These are the forgotten secrets of Titanic, the faces in the crowd. Take, for instance, Violet Jessup. She was not a passenger, but a stewardess, hired to serve the wealthiest aboard. Her job was exhausting. Long hours, little rest, endless politeness. When Titanic struck the iceberg, she was ordered to help women and children into lifeboats. She obeyed, calm but shaken. What most people forget is that Violet had already survived the Titanic's sister ship, Olympic, when it collided with another vessel the year before. And she would later survive yet another disaster, the sinking of Britannic during the First World War. 3 times she stepped aboard ships that fate seemed to mark, and 3 times she walked away alive. To her colleagues, she became something of a legend, a woman who carried within her the strange luck of survival, as if the sea itself could not take her. Or consider the 8 musicians, led by Wallace Hartley. Everyone remembers that they played as the ship went down, but what is often forgotten is the very human detail. They had originally been hired not as a single orchestra, but as 2 separate ensembles. When the ship struck the iceberg, they united, setting aside rivalry to play together for terrified passengers. Survivors recalled them standing calmly on the deck, playing waltzes and hymns while chaos unfolded around them. Their final tune has been debated. Was it Nearer, My God, to Thee? Or perhaps Autumn, a slower, more haunting piece? No one knows for certain. What is certain is that they played until the end, their instruments the last voices heard above the Atlantic's roar. In that, they became more than musicians. They became symbols of calm in the face of terror, a reminder that dignity can survive even as a ship sinks. There were other quiet stories. The Navratil children, 2 young boys traveling under assumed names, carried by their father who was attempting to take them away from their mother after a bitter separation. When he realized he would not survive, he placed them in a lifeboat, kissing them goodbye with words they were too young to understand. They became known afterward as the Titanic orphans, 2 small boys found in New York, speaking only French, their identity a mystery until their mother came to claim them weeks later. Behind the grandeur of Titanic lay such personal tragedies, stories of families broken and reunited, lives altered not only by death, but by survival. Then there were the crew, the stokers deep in the engine rooms. While passengers dined and danced, these men shoveled coal into furnaces, sweating in heat over 100 degrees Fahrenheit. When the iceberg tore into the hull, they were among the first to know, water rushing into their world below decks. Many never had a chance to escape. Yet some stayed at their posts, keeping the lights burning and the pumps working until the last possible moment. Without them, the ship would have sunk far sooner and far fewer would have escaped. Their names are seldom remembered, but their sacrifice gave hundreds of others a chance at life. Another forgotten face is that of Margaret Hayes, a young woman traveling with her little dog. When the ship struck the iceberg, she carried the dog with her into a lifeboat, wrapping it in her coat. The animal survived, one of only a handful of pets to do so. Strange as it may sound, for many survivors, the presence of animals, dogs, cats, even canaries, was a source of comfort in the lifeboats, a reminder of normalcy in the midst of nightmare. It is these small details, easily overlooked, that make the story feel alive. And then there were those who chose differently. Benjamin Guggenheim, a wealthy American, dressed himself in evening wear as the ship began to sink. He was last seen on deck, calmly smoking a cigar, telling those around him, "We are dressed in our best and prepared to go down like gentlemen." His words, whether bravado or resignation, have become part of Titanic's legend. But what is often forgotten is that beside him stood his valet, loyal to the end, a man whose name history barely records. Not all dignity was born of wealth. When we look at these forgotten faces, a pattern emerges. Titanic was not just a ship, it was a mirror of humanity. In its final hours, it revealed courage and cowardice, selfishness and sacrifice, hope and despair. But most of all, it revealed the lives of ordinary people caught in extraordinary circumstances. Their stories, scattered and half-remembered, are the true heartbeat of the Titanic. The great ships of history are remembered for their size, their luxury, their fate. But it is always the people, the stewardess who survived 3 sinkings, the musicians who played until the end, the children carried into lifeboats, the stokers who kept the lights burning, that turned tragedy into memory. And that is why more than a century later, the Titanic still haunts us. Not because of steel and rivets, not because of an iceberg, but because of the human stories it carried, now half lost, waiting to be remembered.
When people tell the story of the Titanic, they focus on the iceberg, one single immovable wall of ice striking steel at midnight. But here lies one of the ship's greatest forgotten secrets. It was not only the iceberg that sank Titanic. It was a chain of tiny decisions, accidents, and oversights, so small they almost seemed trivial, that together turned a glancing blow into the deadliest maritime disaster of its age. Consider the binoculars. In the Crow's Nest that April night, 2 lookouts, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, scanned the horizon for hazards. Their eyes strained in the darkness, relying only on the stars and the dim glow of the sea. Yet what they did not have was binoculars. Why? Because the key to the locker where they were stored had been left behind in Southampton. An officer who was reassigned at the last moment accidentally kept it in his pocket. The lookouts, left with only their eyes, saw the iceberg too late. Fleet himself later testified, "Had we had binoculars, we could have seen it sooner." One forgotten key, one missing tool, may have cost more lives than the iceberg itself. Then there is the matter of speed. Titanic was racing across the Atlantic at nearly full steam, eager to make a record. Not to break one officially, her schedule was too tight for that, but to impress, to show what she could do. Captain Edward Smith, nearing retirement, wanted a triumphant final voyage. Ice warnings had been received by wireless, but they were treated as routine, filed away, barely noticed by passengers enjoying their dinners. The ship pressed forward through a known ice field, not recklessly, but confidently. After all, she was unsinkable. That confidence, more than the ice itself, was fatal. And what of the wireless messages? Titanic carried a Marconi wireless set, one of the marvels of its age, capable of sending and receiving telegraphs across the ocean. On the evening of April 14th, the Californian, a nearby ship, sent warnings of heavy ice. But Titanic's wireless operators were busy transmitting personal messages for wealthy passengers, telegrams to friends and families, trivial details of business and society. Annoyed at the interruption, they told the Californian to shut up. Hours later, when Titanic struck ice, frantic calls for help went unanswered. The Californian lay just 20 miles away, close enough to save hundreds. But its wireless operator had gone to bed. Small choices, missed chances, silence where there should have been sound. Even the lifeboats tell a story of small misjudgments. Titanic carried just 20, though regulations required far fewer. It was a number considered generous at the time, but in reality, it could only carry about half the passengers. Worse, when the order came to launch, officers feared the boats would break if fully loaded. They sent them down half empty. Lifeboat number 7, the first launched, carried just 28 people, though it could hold 65. Survivors rowed away in half-filled boats, hearing cries behind them in the dark. Each boat was a symbol of hesitation, an error born not of malice, but of disbelief. Even as the ship tilted, many passengers refused to board, certain they would be called back once the danger passed. They trusted the Titanic more than they trusted the sea. And then there is the strangest accident of all.
the coal fire. Few know that deep in Titanic's bunkers, a fire had been smoldering since before the ship left port. Fires in coal bunkers were not unusual, but this one burned hot, warping the steel bulkheads near the very spot where the iceberg would strike. Some modern researchers suggest that the fire weakened the hull, making it more vulnerable. Did the iceberg doom Titanic, or did fire soften her armor before the collision? It is one of the mysteries that lingers still, a reminder that disasters are rarely simple. Each of these details, the missing binoculars, the unread warnings, the speed, the lifeboats, the fire, seems small in isolation. Together, they form a chain. Break any one link, and the story might have ended differently. With binoculars, the iceberg might have been seen in time. With slower speed, the ship might have swerved. With more lifeboats, more lives could have been saved. With clearer wireless communication, rescue might have come sooner. Titanic was sunk not only by nature, but by accumulation, the weight of small mistakes, each forgotten until it was too late. This is the haunting truth. The greatest ship of her age was undone not by one great failure, but by a series of ordinary ones. It was not only arrogance alone, nor steel alone, nor ice alone. It was human. And that is why the Titanic still fascinates us more than a century later. Because when we look at her story, we are not just looking at a ship in the dark. We are looking at ourselves, at how easily our confidence, our distractions, our small decisions can unravel into catastrophe. And that, perhaps, is the forgotten secret of Titanic. She did not fall to an iceberg. She fell to 1,000 tiny silences, missed signals, and overlooked details. Proof that history is often shaped not by the grand and obvious, but by the small and unseen.
When people tell the story of the Titanic, they focus on the iceberg, one single immovable wall of ice striking steel at midnight. But here lies one of the ship's greatest forgotten secrets. It was not only the iceberg that sank Titanic. It was a chain of tiny decisions, accidents, and oversights, so small they almost seemed trivial, that together turned a glancing blow into the deadliest maritime disaster of its age. Consider the binoculars. In the crow's nest that April night, two lookouts, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee, scanned the horizon for hazards. Their eyes strained in the darkness, relying only on the stars and the dim glow of the sea. Yet what they did not have was binoculars. Why? Because the key to the locker where they were stored had been left behind in Southampton. An officer who was reassigned at the last moment accidentally kept it in his pocket. The lookouts, left with only their eyes, saw the iceberg too late. Fleet himself later testified, "Had we had binoculars, we could have seen it sooner." One forgotten key, one missing tool may have cost more lives than the iceberg itself. Then there is the matter of speed. Titanic was racing across the Atlantic at nearly full steam, eager to make a record. Not to break one officially, her schedule was too tight for that, but to impress, to show what she could do. Captain Edward Smith, nearing retirement, wanted a triumphant final voyage. Ice warnings had been received by wireless, but they were treated as routine, filed away, barely noticed by passengers enjoying their dinners. The ship pressed forward through a known ice field, not recklessly, but confidently. After all, she was unsinkable. That confidence, more than the ice itself, was fatal. And what of the wireless messages? Titanic carried a Marconi wireless set, one of the marvels of its age, capable of sending and receiving telegraphs across the ocean. On the evening of April 14th, the Californian, a nearby ship, sent warnings of heavy ice. But Titanic's wireless operators were busy transmitting personal messages for wealthy passengers, telegrams to friends and families, trivial details of business and society. Annoyed at the interruption, they told the Californian to shut up. Hours later, when Titanic struck ice, frantic calls for help went unanswered. The Californian lay just 20 miles away, close enough to save hundreds. But its wireless operator had gone to bed. Small choices, missed chances, silence where there should have been sound. Even the lifeboats tell a story of small misjudgments. Titanic carried just 20, though regulations required far fewer. It was a number considered generous at the time, but in reality, it could only carry about half the passengers. Worse, when the order came to launch, officers feared the boats would break if fully loaded. They sent them down half empty. Lifeboat number 7, the first launched, carried just 28 people, though it could hold 65. Survivors rowed away in half-filled boats, hearing cries behind them in the dark. Each boat was a symbol of hesitation, an error born not of malice, but of disbelief. Even as the ship tilted, many passengers refused to board, certain they would be called back once the danger passed. They trusted the Titanic more than they trusted the sea. And then there is the strangest accident of all, the coal fire. Few know that deep in Titanic's bunkers, a fire had been smoldering since before the ship left port. Fires in coal bunkers were not unusual, but this one burned hot, warping the steel bulkheads near the very spot where the iceberg would strike. Some modern researchers suggest that the fire weakened the hull, making it more vulnerable. Did the iceberg doom Titanic, or did fire soften her armor before the collision? It is one of the mysteries that lingers still, a reminder that disasters are rarely simple. Each of these details, the missing binoculars, the unread warnings, the speed, the lifeboats, the fire, seem small in isolation. Together, they form a chain. Break any one link, and the story might have ended differently. With binoculars, the iceberg might have been seen in time. With slower speed, the ship might have swerved. With more lifeboats, more lives could have been saved. With clear wireless communication, rescue might have come sooner. Titanic was sunk not only by nature, but by accumulation, the weight of small mistakes, each forgotten until it was too late. This is the haunting truth. The greatest ship of her age was undone not by one great failure, but by a series of ordinary ones. It was not only arrogance, nor steel, nor ice alone. It was human. And that is why the Titanic still fascinates us more than a century later. Because when we look at her story, we are not just looking at a ship in the dark. We are looking at ourselves, at how easily our confidence, our distractions, and our small decisions can unravel into catastrophe. And that, perhaps, is the forgotten secret of the Titanic. She did not fall to an iceberg. She fell to 1,000 tiny silences, missed signals, and overlooked details, prove that history is often shaped not by the grand and obvious, but by the small and unseen.
When a ship sinks, the story should end at the bottom of the sea. Steel and wood sink into silence, names are carved on memorials, and the world moves on. But the Titanic did not simply vanish into the Atlantic that April night in 1912. Long after her lights went out, whispers lingered, dreams, warnings, coincidences so uncanny that they blurred the line between chance and fate. It is in these stories, half remembered and half believed, that the Titanic lives on as more than a disaster. She becomes a mystery. Even before she sailed, there were those who felt unease. Some passengers later recalled vivid premonitions, dreams that seemed to foreshadow their fate. A few canceled their tickets at the last minute, citing an inexplicable dread. One woman, Mrs. Jessie Brown, told friends she had dreamed of a ship sinking and refused to board. Others were less fortunate. They dreamed of disaster, laughed it away, and stepped aboard anyway.
After the sinking, survivors spoke of those warnings with awe, as though the sea had whispered to them in their sleep. Perhaps the most famous prophecy, however, came not in a dream, but in print. In 1898, 14 years before Titanic sailed, the novelist Morgan Robertson published Futility, later reissued as The Wreck of the Titan. His fictional ship was almost identical, the largest ever built, deemed unsinkable, striking an iceberg in April and sinking with too few lifeboats. The parallels were so precise that after 1912, readers were convinced Robertson had foreseen the tragedy. Skeptics call it coincidence, the natural result of an author imagining what technology of his age might create. Yet the resemblance remains unsettling, a forgotten secret that keeps the Titanic wrapped in a fog of fate. For those who survived, the strangeness only deepened. Many reported haunting dreams in the years that followed, visions of icy water, of cries in the night, of the ship itself rising from the depths. One steward claimed he heard phantom music, the echo of the band that had played until the end, drifting faintly on quiet evenings. Others swore they never set foot on a ship again, unable to shake the sense that the sea itself remembered them. For these men and women, Titanic was not only an event, it was a shadow that followed them for life. There were also strange coincidences among the passengers themselves. Consider the Astors, John Jacob Astor IV, one of the richest men in the world, and his young wife, Madeline. Astor perished, but his wife survived, carrying their unborn child. What is rarely mentioned is that Astor had once spoken of his fascination with disaster at sea. He had even built a scale model of a futuristic lifeboat as a hobby. That such a man would die in a lifeboat shortage seems like history's cruelest irony. Or take the case of Edith Rosenbaum, a fashion journalist traveling with a trunk full of gowns. As the ship sank, she carried into a lifeboat not clothing, but a small toy pig, a musical pig given to her as a good luck charm. In the lifeboat, she wound its handle, and its cheerful tune soothed frightened children as the night wore on. That such a trivial object, a toy pig, should become a symbol of hope is one of those details history hides in its margins. Forgotten by many, it is one of the strangest survivals of all. Even the rescue carried its echoes of mystery. The Carpathia, the ship that saved Titanic survivors, had itself been delayed by ice. Had it sailed on schedule, it might not have been in position to respond. Instead, it arrived just in time to pluck hundreds from the freezing sea. Was it chance, fortune, or the sea's quiet way of balancing the scales? Survivors debated it endlessly, some calling it divine providence, others a cruel joke, saving a few while so many were lost. The coincidences did not end there. Some survivors found themselves linked to the sea again and again. Take Charles Lightlower, Titanic's second officer. He survived the disaster by clinging to an overturned lifeboat. Decades later, during World War II, he used his personal yacht to help evacuate soldiers from Dunkirk, once again saving lives on the water. It is as if his fate remained tied to the sea, haunted by both tragedy and redemption. And then there are the cultural echoes, the way Titanic seemed to leave a mark on art, literature, even collective memory. Plays and poems sprang up within months, some eerily mirroring events survivors had not yet revealed. Families claimed to see visions of lost loved ones in mirrors or to hear their voices in the night. Newspapers told of dreams recorded days before the sinking, written in diaries that only later were read with shivers of recognition. How many were true? How many embellished? It scarcely matters. For those who believed, Titanic had not only claimed lives, but also bent time.
scattering signs before and after her fall. The most haunting coincidence, perhaps, is how ordinary it all seemed until it was not. Passengers wrote letters describing calm seas, music, laughter. Nothing felt wrong. Then, in one sudden collision, everything changed. That shift from ordinary comfort to extraordinary disaster has left a permanent scar on memory. It is why people continue to search for meaning in dreams, warnings, and coincidences, because the Titanic doesn't feel like an accident. It feels like a story written with too much symmetry, too much irony, too much fate to be random. And maybe that's the greatest secret of all. The Titanic reminds us that history is never only about facts. It's about the patterns we see, the signs we choose to believe, the coincidences we can't explain. Dreams, prophecies, strange twists of luck, whether real or imagined, turn a sinking ship into a legend. They make us wonder not just about steel and ice, but about destiny itself. So when you think of the Titanic, remember not only the iceberg and the lifeboats, but also the whispers, the book that foretold it, the dreams that warned of it, the toy pig that played in the darkness, the ship on the horizon that never came. These are the shadows that linger after the sinking, the mysteries that make the Titanic more than a shipwreck. They make it a story that still refuses to end. For more than 70 years after the Titanic slipped beneath the North Atlantic, she existed only in memory and imagination. Survivors told their stories, newspapers reprinted their accounts, filmmakers recreated her final night in flickering black and white. But the ship itself, those steel decks, those twisted railings, those forgotten cabins, lay hidden in the dark, 2.5 miles beneath the sea. The wreck was not found until 1985, when a joint American-French expedition led by Robert Ballard and Jean-Louis Michel finally revealed her resting place. What they discovered was not just a shipwreck. It was a time capsule, a frozen moment of 1912 preserved in silence. And with it came new mysteries, some solved, many still unanswered. The first shock was the condition of the wreck itself. Ballard's team had expected to find Titanic intact, perhaps resting upright on the seabed. Instead, she had broken in two. Her bow lay upright, still hauntingly recognizable, while her stern was a twisted ruin, torn apart as it spiraled downward. The violence of that breakup was greater than many had imagined. How had the ship, deemed unsinkable, come to such a catastrophic end? The evidence on the seabed forced historians and engineers to reconsider long-accepted theories. Titanic had not simply filled with water and slid beneath the waves. She had snapped, torn apart by forces of buoyancy and pressure. The tragedy was greater and more violent than even survivors had known. But then came the smaller, stranger discoveries. Strewn across the seabed were shoes, pairs of boots lying side by side, where bodies had once been. The ocean had claimed the flesh, but leather remained, leaving silent outlines of the people who had died there. To look upon those shoes was to look upon absence itself, mute testimony to lives cut short. Ballard, deeply moved, chose never to remove artifacts from the wreck. He considered it a grave. Others disagreed, and in the years that followed, salvage operations recovered thousands of items: china, jewelry, coins, letters. Each object carried its own story, a whisper from the past. Among the most haunting mysteries were the unopened bottles of champagne, still corked after more than a century, resting silently in the dark. There were menus from the final night, listing elegant dinners of oysters and roast duck. Perfume vials were found, still carrying a faint scent when opened on the surface.
It was as if fragments of 1912 had survived untouched, waiting to be smelled, held, and remembered. And yet with every artifact came the same question. Should they remain at the bottom of the sea, or should they be brought to light? Is Titanic a memorial or a museum? That debate continues to this day, dividing those who see the wreck as sacred from those who see it as history's treasure chest. The wreck also challenged what we thought we knew about the iceberg collision. Analysis of the steel plates showed signs of brittle fracture, suggesting the ship's metal was unusually weak in the freezing Atlantic waters. Microscopic studies of rivets revealed flaws in their manufacture, tiny imperfections that may have caused them to pop under stress, opening seams to the sea. Suddenly, the Titanic sinking was not only about fate, but about materials, about choices made in distant shipyards, invisible to the passengers who trusted her. Then there were the mysteries of time itself. The wreck sits in a place of eternal darkness, where pressures crush and temperatures hover near freezing. Yet even here, life exists. Colonies of bacteria that feed on iron, slowly consuming the ship. These rusticles, icicle-like formations hanging from the wreck, mean that Titanic is dissolving, returning to the sea, grain by grain. Some scientists predict that within decades, perhaps by the end of this century, nothing will remain but a stain on the seabed. The Titanic is dying a second death, not of ice, but of time. This raises a haunting question. What happens when one of history's greatest memorials disappears? Do we let it fade, or do we preserve it artificially, freezing memory once more? And then there is the mystery of the missing pieces. The stern is shattered beyond recognition, but the bow is eerily intact, windows still in place, railings still standing. Why did one half endure while the other disintegrated? Was it the angle of descent, the air trapped inside, or some other factor? Engineers debate, but the sea keeps its secrets. Even more curious, some large sections of the hull appear to have vanished entirely, as if swallowed by the mud. Are they buried beneath the seabed, or were they scattered further away than we realize? Mapping the wreck remains an ongoing task, and with each new expedition, surprises emerge. For the public, perhaps the most tantalizing secret revealed by the wreck was the human connection. The objects recovered were not anonymous. They had owners, names, lives. A pair of spectacles belonged to a school teacher. A gold watch stopped at the hour of the sinking. A locket carried a faded photograph. To hold such things is to feel time collapse, to realize that the Titanic is not only history, but memory, raw and immediate. Survivors may be gone, but their presence lingers in every artifact, every photograph, every shoe resting quietly in the dark. And yet with discovery came myth. Conspiracy theorists claimed the wreck proved long-held suspicions, that Titanic was not Titanic at all, but her sister ship Olympic, switched in an elaborate insurance fraud. Others insisted the break in the hull showed evidence of explosions, not ice. None of these theories have been proven, but their persistence reveals something deeper. The Titanic has become more than a ship. She is a canvas onto which we project our fears, doubts, and fascinations. The wreck does not only answer questions, it asks them. Perhaps the greatest mystery is not what was found, but what was not. Entire sections of the ship remain unexplored, their corridors and cabins still sealed. What lies behind those doors? Documents, diaries, a final record of decisions made that night? We do not know, and perhaps we never will. The pressure is too great, the risks too high. Some secrets may remain forever in the dark. The discovery of the wreck did not end the Titanic story. It began a new chapter. For now we know where she lies, but we also know she is vanishing. Every year, expeditions return with new images.
the grand staircase collapsing, the hull crumbling, the rusticles spreading. The Titanic is dying a second death, not of ice, but of time. What remains is memory and mystery. And maybe that is fitting, for the Titanic has always been more than steel. She has been myth, warning, story. Even as her wreck dissolves into the sea, her legend grows, whispered in dreams, retold in films, remembered in the smallest artifacts brought to light. The Titanic is no longer just a shipwreck. She is a ghost beneath the waves, a reminder that history is never fully gone. It lingers, like the echo of music across dark water, waiting to be heard. When the Titanic went down, she took more than 1,500 lives. But she also took objects, documents, and mysteries that have never resurfaced. In many ways, the ship became a vault, locking away stories that the world will never fully know. These are the forgotten secrets that vanished into the Atlantic and remain unanswered even now. One of the strangest mysteries is the ship's missing logbook. Every ocean liner carried a daily record, courses, weather, notes of events. But when Titanic slipped beneath the sea, her log went with her. To this day, historians can only reconstruct her final hours from survivors' memories, scattered wireless messages, and fragments of testimony. The official record, the captain's words, the last entries, gone. It means the world's most famous shipwreck remains partly a blank page. We know she struck the iceberg, but what decisions were debated on the bridge? What orders were given in those final minutes? Those answers lie forever at the bottom of the sea. Then there are the lost letters. Titanic carried more than 3,000 mailbags, each stuffed with letters bound for America. They included love notes, business contracts, bills, promises, confessions, an entire snapshot of 1912 frozen in ink. Every one of them vanished. Imagine the conversations we will never hear, the voices silenced not by death, but by water. When divers found the wreck, they discovered iron mail sacks still stacked, but the paper had long since dissolved. The Atlantic became the keeper of secrets too personal to survive. Among the lost cargo were also priceless works of art. Titanic carried paintings, sculptures, even a rare edition of Omar Khayyam's Rubaiyat, bound in gold and studded with jewels. Its value was immense, its craftsmanship unique. It sank unopened, perhaps sitting now in the mud, its pages unread for over a century. For collectors, it is a haunting thought, a masterpiece locked in a coffin of steel and water. And then there is the mystery of the safe. Survivors recalled valuables stored in Titanic's purser's office, jewels, cash, gold. Some of these have been recovered by salvage teams, but many have not. Did they sink deeper into the wreckage, or are they still hidden within sealed cabins? The truth may never be known. The ocean is vast, the wreck fragile, and to disturb too much is to risk destroying what remains. Titanic is both a treasure chest and a grave, and we do not know which identity to honor. Even personal belongings tell their own mysteries. Whole trunks of clothes, instruments, diaries, all disappeared. We know of a musician's violin that was later found, water-stained but intact. But how many other instruments lie unrecovered? What music did passengers carry with them? What pages of journals recorded their thoughts that final day? Each vanished object is a lost voice, a silenced witness. Perhaps the most haunting disappearance is that of the iceberg itself. For all its power, for all the destruction it caused, the iceberg drifted silently south and melted within weeks. No one knows its exact shape, its final fate. It slipped back into the sea as though it had never been there, leaving behind only scars in steel and memory. The
The greatest villain of the story, like a ghost, vanished without a trace. And then there are the human mysteries. Some bodies were never recovered, swallowed by the sea. Whole families vanished, their names known only from passenger lists. Survivors spoke of faces they never saw again, companions who seemed to disappear into the night. Each of these is its own secret, a story unfinished. What makes these vanishings so compelling is not just what was lost, but what it means. Every letter gone is a life interrupted. Every object missing is a fragment of history erased. Every document dissolved is a question that will never be answered. The Titanic was more than a ship. It was a library, a museum, a living city. When she sank, she pulled that library into the deep. And unlike other disasters, where ruins can be rebuilt or papers recovered, the Titanic's vault is sealed by the sea. Even now, with advanced technology, we cannot open all its doors. Whole sections of the wreck remain inaccessible, cabins filled with unknown belongings. In those dark rooms may lie diaries, coins, photographs, relics that would astonish us. But to reach them would mean tearing open a tomb. And so, for now, the secrets remain with the ship, hidden in silence. That is perhaps the greatest mystery of all. We know the Titanic better than any ship in history, and yet we will never know her fully. She is both famous and unknowable, remembered and forgotten. Her wreck gives us fragments, glimpses, but never the whole. Like the passengers who walked her decks, her story is incomplete. And maybe that is why she haunts us. Because she reminds us that history is not a finished book. It is a manuscript with missing pages, lost in the deep, unread forever.
When the Titanic disappeared beneath the Atlantic in 1912, the world demanded answers. An iceberg had struck a ship called Unsinkable, and in just 2 hours and 40 minutes, more than 1,500 lives were gone. But the truth, simple as it seemed, never satisfied. Too many coincidences, too many unanswered questions, too much shock. And so, almost from the very morning after, another kind of story began to rise. Not the official record, but the whispers. Titanic, they said, was not just a tragedy. It was a plot, a cover-up, perhaps even a curse. Over the years, these whispers have grown into legends, retold in books, films, and endless speculation. Some are fantastical, some absurd, some strangely convincing. Together, they form a second story of Titanic, one built not on steel and ice, but on shadows. The most famous of these theories is the Olympic switch. Titanic had a sister ship, RMS Olympic, nearly identical in design. In 1911, Olympic suffered a collision that left her damaged. Repairing her was costly, and rumors claim the White Star Line hatched a desperate plan: swap the names of the two ships. Titanic, brand new and unblemished, would be renamed Olympic, while the damaged Olympic would be disguised as Titanic. Then, according to the theory, the ship was deliberately sunk in a staged accident to collect insurance. Supporters of this tale point to odd details: windows and old photographs that don't match, small variations in design between the ships. They argue that only an intentional deception explains such a catastrophic loss. Critics dismiss it as nonsense. Titanic was too new, too expensive, and the insurance payout would never cover her full value. Yet the story persists because it makes the disaster feel less like chance and more like design. Another theory suggests that Titanic did not sink because of an iceberg at all, but because of an explosion deep inside. Some divers claim the wreck shows signs of internal damage, as if a boiler had blown apart. Others argue that coal fires, smoldering in the ship's bunkers even before she sailed, weakened her hull and bulkheads, making her vulnerable to the iceberg's strike.
Still others whisper that an intentional fire was set, a spark in the darkness meant to disguise a larger plot. While historians point out that coal fires were common on steamships, the timing of Titanic's blaze, burning exactly where the iceberg struck, feels uncanny, feeding the idea that her fate was sealed not by ice alone. And then there is the tale of the curse. Titanic carried among her cargo what newspapers later claimed was the mummy of an Egyptian priestess. This so-called unlucky mummy had already gained a reputation in London for bringing misfortune wherever it went. Some swore it had been placed aboard Titanic and that its curse had dragged the ship down. In truth, no mummy was ever on the manifest. The story was invented by a journalist, but once unleashed, it spread too quickly to stop. People preferred the poetry of a curse to the banality of poor planning. To this day, the tale resurfaces, proving that we still crave myth even when facts are available. There are darker theories still. Some insist that powerful financiers were aboard, or were supposed to be. Among the dead were men opposed to the creation of the U.S. Federal Reserve. Could their deaths have been arranged, the sinking a convenient accident? Most historians dismiss this as fantasy, pointing out that just as many financiers survived, including J.P. Morgan, who had planned to sail on Titanic but canceled at the last moment. Yet the coincidence that a man so central to the ship's ownership skipped the voyage that became history's greatest maritime disaster remains suspicious to some. Other conspiracies focus on the rescue that never came. The Californian, that ship just 20 miles away, saw Titanic's rockets but never moved. Was its captain truly confused, or was it ordered to stand down? Some say the Californian was engaged in secret business, smuggling or covert operations, and feared exposure if it approached. Others whisper that it was deliberately placed nearby, part of the switch plot gone wrong. The silence of the Californian remains one of Titanic's most haunting mysteries, fertile soil for speculation. Even the wreck itself has fueled conspiracies. When Robert Ballard discovered Titanic in 1985, he insisted no artifacts be removed. But soon after, other expeditions began salvage operations, pulling china, jewelry, even personal belongings from the seabed. Some claim to find evidence of additional damage, holes in the hull inconsistent with iceberg impact. Were these the marks of explosions, perhaps even sabotage? Or simply the violence of a ship breaking apart under pressure? No consensus has been reached, and the mystery lingers in the shadows of the wreck. And then there is the strangest prophecy of all, the novel Futility, published in 1898, describing the wreck of a giant, unsinkable liner called Titan, struck by an iceberg in April, sinking with too few lifeboats. The similarities are eerie, almost impossible to ignore. Skeptics call it coincidence. Believers call it fate. But whatever it was, it ensured that when Titanic sank, it felt less like an accident and more like destiny fulfilled. Why do these conspiracies endure? Partly because the Titanic is more than a shipwreck. It is the story of human pride, of technology and tragedy, of wealth and poverty, of life and death. Such stories demand meaning. Ice and steel alone cannot satisfy. So we invent patterns, conspiracies, curses, ways to explain the unexplainable. In doing so, we keep Titanic alive, not as wreckage, but as riddle. Perhaps the truth is simpler. Perhaps it is harder. The Titanic sank because of human error, poor preparation, and the merciless indifference of nature. But to accept that is to accept our own fragility. And so, even more than 100 years later, we still reach for other answers. The conspiracies refuse to sink, just as the legend of Titanic refuses to fade. In the end, it may not matter which theories are true. What matters is what they reveal, that we, too, are part of Titanic's story.
We are the ones who search for hidden plots, who weave curses and conspiracies into steel and ice. We are the ones who cannot let her rest.
Most disasters fade. A century passes, and even the most shocking events soften into dates on a timeline, remembered only by specialists or descendants. But the Titanic is different. More than 100 years after she slid into the Atlantic, the ship remains alive in our imaginations. Rebuilt in films, retold in books, reimagined in art. Why? What is it about this one ship, one night, one iceberg that refuses to sink into silence? To answer that is to explore not just history, but memory itself. The first reason is scale. Titanic was the largest moving object ever created at the time, a floating palace of steel and glass. She represented not just a ship, but an age, an era intoxicated by technology, by the belief that mankind had mastered nature. When she sank on her maiden voyage, it was not just steel that broke, it was confidence. People looked at the ocean differently afterward. If the Titanic could fail, perhaps nothing was safe. This shock echoed far beyond the sea lanes, striking at the very heart of modern identity. It was more than tragedy. It was a symbol of human pride meeting nature's indifference. But size alone does not explain the obsession. Other great ships have sunk. Other disasters have claimed more lives. What sets Titanic apart is the story's perfect drama. It contains every element of myth: wealth and poverty, innocence and arrogance, courage and cowardice. The richest men of the age dined under chandeliers, while emigrant families huddled in steerage. Musicians played waltzes as the decks tilted. Lifeboats lowered, half empty, while hundreds cried in the dark. Each detail reads like literature, too symbolic to be real. And yet, it was real. That blend of history and story is irresistible. It makes Titanic not only a fact, but a fable. There is also the power of the survivors' voices. From the moment the Carpathia steamed into New York, with lifeboats of shivering men, women, and children, the world hung on their words. Newspapers printed their stories, each more dramatic than the last. The captain standing firm, the band playing until the end, mothers separated from husbands, strangers offering hands in the dark. These testimonies were not dry reports. They were human dramas, shaping the collective memory from the very start. They gave the Titanic a voice, and that voice has never been silenced. Then came the wreck itself. For decades, Titanic was only a memory, her exact location unknown. When Robert Ballard found her in 1985, it reignited fascination. The photographs of her bow rising from the seabed, railings intact, anchor chains coiled as if waiting, shocked the world. Here was proof that the legend was real, a ghost preserved beneath 2 miles of water. And with it came a new layer of mystery. The artifacts pulled from the deep, shoes still side by side where bodies once lay, perfume bottles that still carried a faint scent. The wreck blurred time, collapsing 1912 into the present. To look at those images was to feel history reaching out of the dark. But beyond objects and survivors, Titanic endures because she asks questions bigger than herself. Why do we trust technology more than nature? Why do we build safety systems we do not fully use? Why do small mistakes, ignored warnings, or simple arrogance cascade into disaster? These are not questions of 1912. They are questions of every age. Each time we fly a plane, launch a rocket, or step aboard a cruise ship, Titanic whispers in the back of our minds, "Are you sure you are safe?" She is a warning, disguised as a memory. And then there is the element of mystery. So much about Titanic remains unknown. Her missing logbook, the unrecovered cargo, the unanswered flares seen by distant ships. Even now, expeditions cannot explore every corridor. Entire cabins remain sealed, perhaps forever, by pressure and darkness. We know a great deal, and yet not enough. This incompleteness makes the story feel alive. Unlike finished tragedies, Titanic remains open-ended, her last secrets still locked beneath the waves. Finally, Titanic endures because she is not only about death, but about humanity. For every act of fear, there was an act of courage. For every story of arrogance, there is a story of dignity. A band that played until the end, a stewardess who led passengers into lifeboats, fathers who kissed their children goodbye, strangers who shared lifeboats and lived together in silence until rescue came. These details are not forgotten because they are what we long to believe about ourselves, that in the face of chaos, we can still be brave, still be kind. Today, Titanic is a mirror. To Americans, she reflects the fragility of progress. To Europeans, she reflects the end of an age of empires and luxury. To the world, she reflects the eternal tension between human ambition and nature's power. Every time her story is retold, we are not only remembering a ship, we are remembering ourselves. And that may be her final, greatest secret. Titanic never truly sank. Yes, her steel lies in pieces on the seabed, rusting away into the dark, but in memory, she sails forever, an endless voyage across history, carrying our fascination, our fears, our questions. She is the ship that refuses to die.
And so, as we close this long journey through the story of Titanic, we are left with more than a shipwreck. We are left with a reminder of human ambition, of fragile pride, of small mistakes that became great disasters. We're left with faces in the crowd, the musicians who played as the decks tilted, the engineers who kept the lights burning, the mothers who kissed their children goodbye. We are left with objects, a watch that stopped at 2:20 a.m., a perfume bottle still carrying its faint scent, a pair of shoes lying side by side on the seabed. Each of these is not just evidence, they're whispers, fragments of a world that ended in the cold Atlantic night. Titanic has become more than steel and rivets, more than statistics of loss. She has become a story, retold across generations, never fading, never quiet. A century later, we still lean closer when we hear her name. Because deep down, Titanic is not only about the past. She is about us, about the choices we make, the warnings we ignore, the belief that progress can shield us from nature's power. And yet, in remembering her, we also remember something tender, that even in tragedy, there was music. Even in darkness, there was courage. Even in loss, there was love. Those details are why Titanic still sails in memory, long after her hull has begun to dissolve into rusticles and mud. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, imagine her once more, not broken on the seabed, but whole, gliding across a calm sea beneath a sky full of stars. Passengers strolling the deck, laughter in the lounges, music drifting through the night air. A floating city, alive just for a moment before history closed its hand. That is the Titanic we carry with us. The dream and the tragedy, the silence and the song. Good night. May her story rest with you gently, like the hush of waves on a quiet ocean, reminding us that even the greatest ships are fragile, and that memory, unlike steel, never sinks.